Hi, and welcome to number 11 in this video series called Beginnings. We are looking at the first chapters of the Bible, the opening chapters of the book of Genesis. And this video is called Noah, the Ark, and the Flood. And we're going to be looking at the story of Noah. And I think you'll find it to be a very interesting and I hope helpful video. So thank you for watching, and we'll get started. Well, in the popular mind, the story of Noah does show up in a lot of places. It's a story that a lot of children first hear in Sunday school or church school classes. It's also a story that was part of the background of the movie Evan Almighty in 2007, I think it was. And then in 2014 or so, the movie called Noah came out, and I think that was a very interesting retelling of the story of Noah. And of course, in those stories you do meet Noah, and you do find a lot of water, the flood, and a large boat, the ark, with Noah, his family, and all the animals. Well, there are three things that I think are very important to keep in mind. So three things which I think are kind of an introduction before we dive into the actual story. And I think that when you keep these three things in mind, you can avoid a lot of needless controversy and difficulty. So the first thing to keep in mind is what is known as the ancient Near Eastern cosmology. So the way in which people in the Middle East or the Near East in ancient times thought of the universe or the world. And the way they thought of it was roughly this way. And by the way, you can get a nice overview of this on a website called Biologos, Biologos. So the way that ancient Near Eastern people thought of the world was like this, that the earth was flat, that under the earth there was water, so if you drilled a well, water would gush up, and that above the earth there was more water. The sky was a dome, and it held up more water, and that's why the sky is blue. So this way of looking at the world fit in with the way most ordinary people observe the world, that the world is kind of flat. And if you dig down deep enough, water does come up. And the sky is like a dome, and water, rain would sometimes come down from it. This is the kind of cosmos that is described in the first chapter of Genesis. And I talk about that in one of the earlier videos in this series, so you might want to take a look at that. So again, that was just the way that people, through common, ordinary observation, experienced the world. So that's one thing to keep in mind. A second thing to keep in mind is that flood stories appear all over the planet in older indigenous cultures. So for example, where I live in Nova Scotia, Canada, the indigenous people are known as Mi'kmaq. So there's a book, The Old Man Told Us, excerpts from Mi'kmaq history by Ruth Holmes, Nimbus Publishing, 1991. So here's one of the Mi'kmaq stories about the past. Before the earth was new, the sun was all that existed in the great universe. The sun divided the earth into several parts, separated by many great lakes. In each part, the sun caused one man and one woman to be born. They bore children and lived for many years. Wickedness pervaded in this family, and slowly they killed one another. The sun wept and wept with grief. The tears became rain that fell from the skies until water covered the entire earth. The family had to set sail on bark canoes to save themselves from the flood. A violent wind overturned their boats. All perished in the sea, but the old man and the old woman, who were best of all people, it was they who populated the earth. So there's a number of things that are different in this story, different from the story of Noah in the Bible. But you often see a number of parallels, that there's one man and one woman who repopulate the earth. There's a flood. It is caused by tears of the son. That doesn't happen in the story of Noah, but the son wept with grief. And in the story of Noah, God is grieved about the sins and evil that's in the world. So that's a very interesting parallel thing to take notice, and these kinds of things show up in many parts of the world. Also, then, in the ancient Near East, quite apart from the story of Noah that we find in the Bible, there were other flood stories. I've got a hunch that behind these flood stories all over the planet were real floods. I'm not a geologist or whatever field one would have to study to know about these things, but I think in terms of the ice ages, the last ice age vanishing and the glaciers receding and the water, maybe that's part of the background. But anyway, in the Middle East, there is also ancient flood stories. So the most famous one of these is found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is Babylonian, and it's a fairly long story. But inside of it, there's a smaller story about Utnapishtim, and this is how that part of the story goes. Long ago, in a city called Shurapak, the god Enlil grew sick of the city's noisiness and created a flood to destroy mankind. But one man, Utnapishtim, received instructions in a dream from the god E, saying to build an enormous boat. Sure enough, the flood came, and Utnapishtim, with his family, his animals, and his craftsmen, were safe. They all stayed at sea until a bird they released did not come back to the ship, having presumably found shore. The gods criticized Enlil for punishing mankind too harshly, and in return he granted Utnapishtim his immortality. So you can see some differences there, and we'll get to the main one in just one second, but a lot of parallels. A flood that covers the earth, evil in the world, and a boat and one man and his household that end up being able to give a future to the human race, and also a bird that's released. And if you take a look at the story of Noah, there are a number of birds in that story as well. So a number of very strong parallels between the story of Utnapishtim and the story of Noah. And one way to see the story of Noah is that it's a story from the ancient Near East of a great flood, but in this particular story, all the gods have been stripped away. A big word for that is demythologizing. Instead of quarreling gods, in the story of Noah, there's just one God. And so the story of the flood in Genesis is a retelling of the flood traditions in the ancient Near East, but it's being retold in order to reveal new and literal truths. God is one, being one of them. That's the first, and we'll consider others a bit later in the talk. So in terms of introduction, many flood stories, and the first thing that I mentioned was the ancient Near Eastern cosmology. The third thing to remember before we dive into the text is concerning the nature of the first chapters of Genesis, not just the story of Noah, but the other stories that come before and after it. And these chapters are together a story filled with events and people, and a story first shared among the Jewish people who God had rescued from their slave masters in Egypt about 3,500 years ago. Moses, the leader of the Jewish people, he's collecting, he's assembling, perhaps he's editing, reworking, maybe others were involved, inspired by God, and they put everything together, and they assembled all this, and delivering the finished product. It's kind of a trite way to put it, but delivering that finished product to the Jewish people as they traveled to the land that God had prepared for them to go. So they're fleeing Egypt, they're traveling to the promised land, and they're settling there. And as they're going through all these things, they're learning the stories and other things that Moses is presenting to them. So these opening chapters of Genesis provide something that the people need. It connects them to the time of the foundations of the world as God created it. And this connection is established by the use of a kind of storytelling that would make sense to the people of that time. So a lot of people are mentioned, a lot of geographic references, genealogies, and all of that. And one thing that I was taught when I was studying these things was that no one really knows exactly how the stories in these early parts of the Bible connect with real events and real people. But nevertheless, these stories do tell us real and true things about God, about the world, and ourselves. And in particular, for those first readers, those Jews living 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, these stories reveal that their God is the one true, living, and trustworthy creator. And I would say that those Jews and we ourselves living today become properly oriented and well-living people when we worship this God. Okay, so that's introduction. Let's dive into the text. So a little bit of background. In the story up to this point, the first chapters were terrific, but then we discovered that from the beginning, people began doing things wrong, kind of even creating a partnership with evil, and a large part of the human community goes very badly, evil, violence, and by the time we get to Noah, violence abounds, and God is grieved and thinks he's going to start over. So in the meantime, God is working with Noah, who's described as a righteous man. So, God feels that Noah is in some ways worthy of working with as God wants to move forward. So then we get to the story, and as I mentioned earlier on, when we meet Noah, in the story, the world is in very rough shape. God has been working with a part of the human community, but another significant chunk of it has gone very dark, and evil is rampant, and the creation to God seems ruined by what people are doing. So God approaches Noah, and then it mentions Noah's sons. And then God gives Noah instructions for building a ship. And true to a story which would engage people, there are dimensions to the ship are offered. The kind of wood is described, rooms and so forth, levels. And Noah is instructed to build this huge wooden vessel as a place for his family and for the animals of the world, for a representative sampling, so to speak, to enter the ark and to stay there safe while the world is flooded. And so this all happens in the story. Noah builds the ark, and his family and the animals enter the vessel. So the flood lasts for a number of days. In the account, it talks about 40 days and 40 nights, and there's other periods of time, and it's quite a few months that everyone is in the vessel. And at the end of chapter 7, we read that the high water mark reached 20 feet above the crest of the mountains. Everything died, anything that moved, dead birds, farm animals, wild animals, the entire teeming exuberance of life, all people, all of it dead. So it very much drives home the point that God has unleashed these waters upon the earth and everything is drowned. So we need to think a little bit about one of the things I mentioned concerning the introduction, and that is the cosmology, the way that ancient Near Eastern people saw the world. So you remember the water above the dome sky, and you remember the water under the flat earth. And in the story of Noah and the flood, water gushes up from below and it pours down through what in some Bible translations are called the windows or the doors of heaven. So the idea that the writer has in mind is that these chaotic waters, which incidentally God put in their place in the opening page of the Bible, but these chaotic waters, God permits them to rise up and to engulf the world, to inundate it with water. And so chaos and death, water overwhelms all of life. So then the ark with its Noah's family and all the animals are there, and then there's a certain point at which the rain stops, the waters begin to recede a bit. Noah sends out a raven. It doesn't find any place to really live, and it comes back. Noah sends out a dove, same thing. He sends out a second dove. That second dove comes back with an olive branch. So that's an indication to Noah that things are growing. When I read that, I wonder, maybe we're supposed to think of the ark as kind of a space that doesn't have any windows, so Noah and the rest don't really look outside to see what's happening. But anyway, the dove does find does find some vegetation, and then another dove goes out, and this dove does not return. So that's an indication to Noah that the dove has found a place to build a nest, and that, of course, entails trees and vegetation and things with which to build a nest. So they know that the waters are receding, and eventually the ark comes to rest on a mountain, and the waters recede completely, and it's finally safe for the animals and the family to emerge and to begin to live again, and in that way to start filling the earth with the animals and human family. The community is permitted to fill the earth again. And so along the way, God says, whenever I see a rainbow from now on, I'll remember a promise that I'm making. And so God covenants never again to flood the earth, to kill everything. He promises to keep the earth going with its seasons. It's a very interesting thing, this rainbow thing. My studying, in studying it, I've kind of seen that the best way the most interesting way to understand the rainbow is that the rainbow is, from God's perspective, a reminder of his promise to keep the earth going. But also there's an element of danger in it for God. In the ancient Near East, it was quite common for people making agreements to make self-maledictory oaths, is what they're called. And it means that if I don't do such and such, may it be upon my head. So you might endanger your life if you didn't keep your promise. And the rainbow is meant to be a weapon that is in a sense aimed at God. If he doesn't keep his promise, then that's a threat on God. So I mean, it's a figure of speech, but it illustrates the intensity of the covenant that God has with the created world. So God promises to keep the earth going with all the seasons, and God also says something else. He says, from now on, the vegetation and the animals, Noah and your family and all the human community, it's all there for you to eat. You just can't eat anything that has the lifeblood in it. And concerning human lifeblood, God says, whenever human lifeblood is spilled, that person will also suffer the same penalty. This is, I think, very interesting because earlier on in the earlier chapters, God cuts down the tradition of vigilante justice. Lamech, who's a very hard and abusive man, brings back the tradition of vigilante justice. And I've talked about that in an earlier video or two. And now and then of course before the story of Noah and the flood, the earth has gone very badly. There's a lot of killing, a lot of evil, and now it's as if God is saying, okay, the human community is going to start again. I'm giving Noah and his family similar blessings to the ones I gave to Adam and Eve at the creation. I'm giving you all these blessings, but from now on I also want you to know that all this killing needs to come to an end. So I think there's meant to be kind of a new day for the human race. So there's all that in the story, and then we get to the very end of it, and then the story ends with a bit of a cloud because Noah, it says, was the first to plant a vineyard. He makes wine, and he gets plastered. And so one of his sons finds him drunk, ridicules his dad. The other two sons, however, manage to find a way to treat Noah with some dignity, and they don't. Noah's lying around so drunk that he's got no clothes on. So the other two sons find a way to dress him without making fun of him, and then Noah, I guess, awakes from his hangover and pronounces a curse on the son who ridiculed him. So it ends with kind of a dark cloud because we discover that there's dysfunctions going on in the family, and Noah and his sons are not altogether perfect. So from this we can kind of pick up that however the human race unfolds from Noah and his wife and family, whatever happens in the future, it's not going to be perfect. There's already a fly in the ointment. So that brings us to the very end of the story of Noah and the ark and the flood. So I want to just end with a few lessons which I think are totally appropriate for all people at all times. The one is, God is one and he's in charge of the world. He rules over all. And of course that lesson is driven home many times in these opening chapters, and it's a pervasive perspective that's all over the Bible. But yes, there's not a number of gods competing with one another in this retelling of the flood stories, the flood traditions in the ancient Near East. The truth emerges that there is one God, and he is it. Secondly, this God hates evil. Now, this might seem as kind of a threat, and perhaps we could see it that way because we do things wrong. But I think we ought to take great comfort from it, because if God hates evil, well, that is a good thing, because it means that evil is not going to have the last word. And as I often say when I'm leading services for people who have died, death is not the last word for this person, right? So God hates evil. That is a good thing. God is not cozy with evil. He hates it. So that means that, again, however the future unfolds, it's going to be managed by a God who does not want evil. Nevertheless, even though God hates evil and evil does exist in the world, nevertheless, God continues to uphold the world. He preserves the world as a stage for the human community to flourish, but also as a stage for his ongoing work of redemption, healing, forgiveness, rebuilding, restoration. So we ought to see, China, the USA, Northwest Territories, New York City, the Annapolis Valley where I live. We ought to see every refugee camp as legitimate arenas for the flourishing of people, the people who live there, and as a legitimate stage for God to continue to work with the human community. And then a final lesson, and that is that God is determined to make real his work of redemption through the human race. So this goes back to, in one of the earlier chapters, where God says to Eve, the mother of all the living, God says to Eve, one of your children, a human child, will defeat evil. So again, I talk about that in an earlier video. So that covenant with Eve, that promise that God has made to Eve, he's not forgetting it. So the human race is going to continue, and that means that somewhere down the road, a person is going to emerge who is going to defeat evil. So that's it for my take on the story of Noah, the ark, and the flood. I hope that's been helpful to you. Thanks so much for watching. Video number 12 will be coming up next week. In the meantime, subscribe and like and share and all those good things. And again, I will see you next time. Be well.